Morena, kia ora tātou, rangatira mai, hau mai nei, kei waingani a mātou mo tēnei wāhanga kōrero, mui te timatanga o ngā kōrero, rui a tahia, ka hemoa ki te kākoa, kia herea mai ki te kāwau koro ki, e tataki mai ane i tana pūkoro whaikoro, he kuaka mārangaranga, anei ngā manu kuaka mārangaranga e tau mai nei i tēnei ata, nau mai, piki mai, kake mai. Kia ora whānau, ko Troy Para tēnei, e mihi atu nei ki a koutou. My name is Troy Para and I'm the host for you today for our Water Services Authority Taumata Arawai Wastewater Environmental Performance Standards. Aroha mai whānau, he mouthful tēnā. Just want to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this webinar. It will be a riveting session, I can assure you. And the reason why I know that is we've had people who are coming back for their second bite of the salve. So no mai hoki mai ki a koutou that are coming back again. Just a few housekeeping rules. This session is being recorded and it can be made available on request along with the slide pack. So if you mena kei te hia koutou to see the slide pack, by all means, we can arrange to have that emailed out to you. We do have a question and answer session, and our preference, please, or section, is that you put your pārtai into the Q&A. Kei te pai, and halfway through this session, we'll have a section where we'll be able to answer those pārtai. There will also be a section at the end where you'll also be able to give us your questions. Hey, submissions. He tino kaupapa tēnei. This is very, very important. So write it down. Submissions need to be to us by 5 p.m. So that's before the chase starts. 5 p.m. Thursday, 24th of April. Kei te pai. And I'll, as we continue through the webinar, I'll just reiterate that with you. Furthermore, there will be 4 Q&A sessions in the week of 14th April to the 17th of April, and those sessions will be held as an opportunity to get those nagging pārtai out before you make your submission by 5 p.m. before the chase on Thursday the 24th of April. Kei te pai. Hey, look, I'm going to introduce you to 2 members of our team, and the first one, and it's going by order of most handsome, is John Kingi. Tēnā koe, John.
Tēnā koutou, o tira kia koe Troy, nau I whakatūwhire tō tata nei hui. Koe tēnei huri tēnei no tuahua tainui, no ngā puhi anō hoki, ko John Kingi tēnei. Kia ora tātou, my name is John Kingi. I'm a Chief Advisor here at the Authority, Taumata Arawai, and I've been working across our iwi hapu engagement and around the treaty settlement mahi. So really looking forward to talking through some of the work that we've undertaken and answering any specific pārtai that you may have. You may also have seen me on some of the general webinars as well. Kia ora tātou, I'll pass to Michael Petherick.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Michael Petherick tōku ingoa. I'm Tangi Treaty, and I'm that guy that you normally see on webinars who's the kind of technical support for the team.
Kia ora, tēnā koe, Michael.
Ka pai. So I think I'm going to walk us through the first few slides. We'll pause and allow pārtai at that point, and then we'll go through some of the, I guess, proposals around the standards themselves. So next slide, please. So why are we undertaking this work? We've identified that over the next 10 years, we know around 60% of our public wastewater infrastructure will require reconsenting, so a significant proportion. We also know that around 20% of the plants across Aotearoa currently are operating on expired consents, Section 124s, and we're aware of some examples of plants such as Wastewater where they've been operating on an expired consent for 20 plus years. So we've identified an opportunity, I guess, to put in place some standards which may be able to address the upcoming bow wave of consents, as well as try to address some of those plants that have been sitting on expired consents for a number of years. Next slide, please. And I guess within this approach, we're trying to balance some of these factors that are highlighted on the slide, and some of the benefits that we see from a standardized approach, which are articulated here. So the first is obviously a need to ensure public and environmental health. And there are certainly some potential benefits that we see from standards that address all of the treatment areas, which we'll go into later. But certainly improving public health and environmental outcomes is an important consideration in this work. The other area is around cost and time efficiency. So we know that within the current consenting, processes, there are significant cost implications from the consenting process that exists currently and the bespoke nature of that consenting process. By standardizing, across the areas that our standards are looking to be applied to, we're looking for some cost efficiencies, but also the potential for time efficiencies. And finally is those community aspirations. So improving transparency, giving clarity to communities around the cost of the infrastructure solutions that are best suited for them. And balancing those three areas is a key aim in the standards work. A couple of other benefits that we want to flag. The first is that our proposals include a viable discharge to land standard, which is an alternative to discharge to water. And we know that for iwi and hapu in particular, discharge of wastewater to water bodies is a significant concern. And so it was important to us that as part of these proposals, there was a viable discharge to land standard proposed. We also see there being potential benefits around ensuring communities have better access to information, transparent reporting and monitoring, which are also considered as part of the standards, as well as trying to reduce some of the costs that we know iwi and hapu bear through drawn out and costly engagement processes through the consenting process. So these are some of the areas where there may be benefits to iwi and hapu, but also to broader communities. Next slide, please. So how did we come to develop and land on the proposals, which we'll talk about soon? So we did a lot of work throughout 2024 to identify what some options could look like. So we commissioned some initial advice on what standards could look like. As part of that process, we also commissioned a number of case studies to understand iwi and hapu values in wastewater treatment. We looked at both national and international best practice, and that all came together to, land on some initial preliminary technical advice. We then received that advice and developed and refined that advice further into the proposals that are now out for consultation. So some of the elements through that refining process included the establishment of a technical review group. So that group included local government, industry experts, some of our board and Māori advisory group members as well. We also sought additional technical advice from the likes of iwi and hapu practitioners who were invited to share some comments on the proposals, and obviously some engagement as well across the sector to inform the proposals that are now available publicly. As part of that process, we also had to undertake a regulatory impact and cost assessment process as well. Next slide. So I'm going to touch now on our iwi and hapu approach, and some of this will expand further. For those of you who were on the general webinars, we're going to provide a little bit more detail around the work that we've undertaken. So at a high level, we've undertaken a range of work to meet our treaty and legislative obligations. So the authority has some really clear obligations to some specific treaty related obligations to some specific river catchment areas. We also have obligations as part of our operating principles where we have to engage meaningfully with iwi Māori and also need to ensure that we are trusted and enable elements of mātauranga and tikanga in some of the work that may cross over Māori interests. So that, I guess, gives you a sense of the broad nature of the obligations that sit across us. This slide details some of the specific work that we've done to try and meet those obligations. So some targeted engagement, some broader engagement, including webinars such as this, some additional technical expertise and advice that we've sought, and now through the public consultation phase. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have some specific treaty settlement obligations. These are in the Waikato, Waipa and Whanganui River catchments. And those obligations require us to ensure that when a decision maker is exercising a power under our legislation, that they must respond to and consider the specific treaty settlement arrangements in those river catchments. So for the Waikato catchment, that's consideration of the likes of Te Ture Whaimana and related arrangements, including joint management arrangements or specific catchment arrangements. And in the Whanganui catchment, that is consideration of Te Awa Tupua and the relevant arrangements there as well. We have begun initial conversations with relevant river iwi around what discharging those obligations would look like from their perspective. And we also need to be considerate of the entities that may have been created, for example, the Waikato River Authority or Te Pou Tupua, and importantly as well, territorial authorities and regional councils in those areas. We are interested if there are arrangements in your rohe or area, your wahi, that you think we should be looking into that we may not have considered. We really invite your views on what those arrangements might be that we need to consider through the consultation. Next slide, please. So along with those specific treaty settlement obligations, we're also undertaking analysis of broader arrangements. So for example, we know that there are mechanisms under the Resource Management Act, for example, that establish iwi participation agreements or mana whakahono arohe agreements at place between local councils and iwi and hapu. So we are considering what those arrangements and look like and what the obligations might be around the standards. And we're continuing to analyze all of the Treaty Settlement Acts currently. We've done about 50 so far, and we've got 32 to go. So that work is progressing, and that may also unveil additional specific obligations that we need to consider as part of the standard setting. Proactive engagement has been ongoing, so we've reached out to those iwi and hapu groups that we've identified have those sorts of arrangements in place to see if they would like to engage with us through the standard setting process. Next slide. So I want to just talk a little bit about the case studies that we worked on to detail iwi and hapu values in wastewater treatment. So you would have seen those case studies detailed in the case study report, which is available in the suite of documents that we've released as part of the consultation. It has been an integral part of our standard setting process that we, in recognition of the significant, I guess, interest that Māori, iwi and hapu have in wastewater and the impacts of that discharge on the taiao, that we understood as best as we could iwi and hapu perspectives and the experience of iwi and hapu in the existing consenting process. We undertook some initial desktop analysis alongside Iwaitahi, who supported the development of that work, to try and identify some treatment plants across the country with differing characteristics that we could then reach out to and undertake some more intensive engagement to build the case studies that are now available through the consultation. The selected plants were Gisborne, Taipa, Porirua, Cambridge, Pukekohe and Rotuiti Rotomā. And we did do our best to try and get a Te Waipounamu, a South Island plant, but we weren't able to get one of those plants across the line due to a number of factors. But we have undertaken some additional engagement with Ngaitahu, and we're planning to continue to engage with them to ensure that a Te Waipounamu view is included in our standards development process. We also engaged with relevant territorial authorities and regional council staff in the development of those case studies. So those perspectives have also been incorporated where relevant. Next slide. Just moving on slightly, I guess just flagging the legislative framework and I guess the process around which standards are set. So we have the ability to set wastewater standards across a broad range of areas. Standards only apply to public wastewater networks. So private or on-site systems are we're not currently empowered by our legislation to set standards for those plants. Standards have direct effect on resource consents as they come up for renewal, so that's the mechanism that they hook in via. As I've already mentioned, those treaty settlement obligations are there that we must consider as well. And importantly, there are a number of changes that are being flagged or proposed to the standards as part of the Local Government Water Services Bill, which is currently before Parliament. So I guess our proposals are based on the assumption that many of those changes will go through as well. Importantly as well, with the proposed approach to consent duration, is that if a consent is granted for a wastewater treatment plant and it adheres to the standards, that a 35-year consent will be issued for that consent. Right, there was a lot of part from me. Sorry, Troy.
Kia ora whānau. Before we hand over to the fastest bloke in the room, we're going to give you an opportunity to put your hanawiti down, your sandwich down, and if you do have any pātai, this is an opportunity for us to answer those.
Geez, that's comprehensive, eh? Fantastic.
Fine. Well, feel free to put more questions in the chat, but
Yeah.
otherwise I'll hand back to Troy, I think, or Michael.
Ka pai, over to you, Michael.
Next slide, thanks. So there are 4 standards that are being proposed as part of our work program. So they are the discharge to water standard, discharge to land standard. So those first 2 will apply to wastewater treatment plants, and they deal with the main things that you would expect to see in a discharge consent, depending on whether the plant goes to water or land or both. There is a standard that's being proposed for biosolids, the beneficial reuse of biosolids. And then finally, there is a standard that is proposed for overflows, and that is around a consistent consenting approach for overflows based on risk management. So we're going to deal with the discharge to water and discharge to land standards first. I just want to take a step back and explain why these standards are being proposed, because they are something that actually has been proposed not just by this government, but they're actually in the legislation and were proposed as a priority by the previous government. And that is because, as John has pointed out, so the existing system isn't working in terms of the processing of consents. So 20% of plants sitting on expired consents for an average of 5 years. Some plants are going through consent processes multiple times. So a really good example is Cambridge, which was non-compliant with its resource consent for something like 25 years, went through 3 consent processes to get us to the point where we are now with what you would expect to see modern consenting arrangements for that plant. The other thing other reason that we are proposing standards is because if you look at the limits that are set out in consents, lots of plants have monitoring requirements for the main contaminants, whether they're discharging to water or land, but they don't have limits. There are actually relatively small number of limits that are set out in consents. Generally, plants are required to monitor things, but there are not limits. Where those limits do exist, they're often phrased in ways that make them very difficult to enforce. And that is a problem right throughout the country. They're phrased ambiguously, so enforcement is actually difficult for a regional council, even if it wanted to get on and do it. The other difficulty that we have seen is that if you look at what is in those consents, there is no relationship between what's in a consent, the type of the plant, the receiving environment. There's no correlation between what is in the consent and the receiving environment, or the consent duration, or the age of the plant. Basically, plants are consented and the treatment requirements are put into the consent plant by plant, and it's completely unsystematic. There's no consistency within a region and no consistency between regions. Now, people have a hard time believing that, but we have done that work really comprehensively, and it was put out in about 2019 for regional councils to consider and respond to, and there hasn't been any change. The other reason that we are here is because there is not transparency around compliance with plants. So it's very difficult to know if plants in your area are complying with their consent limits, what few limits there are. What we know, although we don't know much, what we know is that most plants are not complying with their consents regularly. We also know that enforcement action by regional councils is fairly rare, despite the fact that there appears to be widespread non-compliance. So this is a picture of what we would describe as complete regulatory failure. The incentives are not sitting in the system to require plants to be operating in a way that meets consent conditions and promotes good environmental and public health outcomes. So we're not here to try and take consultation away from communities. What we're here to do is try and get a step change in how these plants operate and the involvement that communities can have in knowing whether they're operating well. Putting that aside, so the discharge to water standard, this is quite a big change to the way that consenting processes currently work. So what the discharge water standard does is it categorises water bodies based on their sensitivity. This is quite common internationally. End of pipe standards that are based on categories of water bodies are quite common internationally, but it's not something that we have seen here in New Zealand. So you have 7 different categories of water body, and they vary based on sensitivity. And so you go all the way from open ocean, then you go through the freshwater bodies, high dilution, medium dilution, and low dilution. Then you have estuaries, and then you have lakes. Treatment requirements for the main contaminants that are found in treated wastewater are set according to the category of water bodies. So the plants in your area, you determine what the type of water body it is discharging to, and then the treatment requirements will be set. Now, a regional council won't be able to set treatment requirements that are lower or higher. Those treatment requirements will be fixed. That's a proposal that is sitting in the local government water services bill in Parliament, and it's a priority for this government that the treatment requirements are fixed. The standard will also fix the monitoring, reporting requirements and the compliance conditions for plants. So this is what we are talking about here. The proposal is for significantly greater public information around the compliance of plants with consents. There would be monthly public reporting around compliance with consents, and then there would be annual reporting that would be audited, that would be made public. So everybody would know whether the plant in their area was complying with those main contaminants. There's a proposal for tailored treatment requirements for small wastewater treatment plants. So the small wastewater treatment plants are about half of the plants in the country. It's really small oxidation ponds in isolated areas. If the general standard was to apply to those small treatment plants, it would be extremely expensive for those small communities to upgrade. So the general standard is intended to apply to the big plants that service our towns and cities, but the small ones, if you had to have a big city plant in place of an oxidation pond, it would be extremely expensive for those communities and basically unaffordable. So the small treatment plant standard is intended to be tailored to how those oxidation ponds operate. Now, under the standards regime, there would be 35-year consents issued. That's a really big change to the current system. At the moment, you often have what are called bridging consents. So if a plant can't meet any kind of upgrade, then it'll get a 1 or 2 year consent, and they can roll on for, in Cambridge, I think there were 2 or 3 of those bridging consents. You see that all over the country. And then once a consent is issued, it's often issued for 10 or 15 years. So for this government, the 35-year consent is important, and it's important because the territorial authority needs to have the certainty to engage in that major upgrade that's required to lift the plant performance and make sure it complies all the time. Now, finally, there are exceptions proposed as part of the standard. And so the exceptions are intended to be exceptions. That's the direction that we've had from our ministers. Exceptions will be exceptional. So if you've got the bell curve, it's the little bits that are either end. So an example of exceptions is where a plant's discharging to a really pristine water body. Now, generally, plants don't discharge to pristine water bodies. Plants often sit low in the catchment, where something like 75% of our catchments where the plants are discharging to are degraded, significantly degraded. So pristine water bodies, if a plant is discharging to a pristine water body, then you would go through the normal consenting process. The standard wouldn't apply. If the plant is discharging to a really low dilution water body, again, the standard doesn't apply, and you go through the normal consenting process. There are about 30 plants that are discharging to things like drainage ditches or really small streams where the discharge overwhelms the water body. And what's going on there is this is a legacy effect of the existing system. So what councils have done is they've used drainage ditches or small streams as pipes. What we hope to incentivise through the exception is that councils would get that discharge out of that small water body and they would put it somewhere more appropriate. Next slide, thanks. So this is the treatment wheel. This sets out how the standards basically work. So you've got running around, if you go around clockwise, you've got your 7 different receiving environment categories: open ocean, inshore coastal, the different freshwater environments, estuaries, which are very sensitive and precious environments where lots of people go, and there's things like shellfish gathering, and lakes. And so the treatment requirements increase as you go around that treatment wheel. Of course, the cost of treatment also increases as you go around the wheel. One of the things that we have done as part of the level that standards set the treatment limits, they are set based on what you can see in existing modern consents. So although the open ocean has lower treatment than you would expect than for a lake, for example, the treatment requirements are consistent with what you would see in modern consents. So for example, Moore Points here in Wellington, Tahuna in Dunedin. That's been quite an important part of the arrangements. Across the board, the treatment requirements are set at a level that is intended to protect public health and the environment. So the plants are intended to lift the water quality in their catchments. They are not intended to let it sit at the current degraded level that we see across 75% of those catchments they discharge to. The plants are intended to lift their weight. And for the treatment requirements in terms of pathogens, so E. coli and enterococci, that's the things that make people sick. They are set across the board at recreational bathing quality. That's a reasonably high standard, recreational bathing quality. Now, if the plant is discharging to a place where there is shellfish gathering close by, that pathogen standard doesn't apply, and the council has to get a quantitative microbial risk assessment, which is a new thing that I learned about a couple of months back, and I've managed to memorize now. QMRA is what people in the industry call it. So if there's a plant that's discharging next to somewhere where there's mahinga kai practices, collecting shellfish, then the pathogen standard doesn't apply. You get your QMRA, and that will set the treatment requirements. And that's something that's quite common here. It's international best practice. Internationally, people have looked at New Zealand and said, well, this is a really, really good way of approaching things. Don't give it up as part of your standards work program. So that's why that is proposed. Next slide, thanks. So this is the slide that sets out the treatment requirements, the measurement approaches. So if you look along the left-hand side, you'll see the contaminants. These are the different contaminants that would be regulated as part of a standard. So they are the main things that come out of plants. BOD, which is if it's present in too high levels in water bodies, it will kill things. Total suspended solids, that's how cloudy the discharge is. Nitrogen and phosphorus, they are your nutrients. Ammonia, that's the thing that kills fish, aquatic life and plants. E. coli and enterococci, so they are the pathogen standard. And if you look along the top, running from left to right, you'll see lakes, rivers and streams, so the freshwater environments, and then on the right you can see the saline environments, estuaries, and the two coastal environments. So the treatment standards the treatment limits that are proposed are intended to be protective of public health and the environment. Seeking submissions on that. Next slide, thanks. So as we've talked about, the regional councils won't have the ability to set higher or lower levels of treatment for those contaminants. I want to emphasise, in current consents for plants, the suite of limits that you see there across those 6 different treatment requirements, normally plants they don't have treatment limits for all 6. They might have treatment limits for 1 or 2 of those things, but it's quite rare to have them for all 6. So requiring them for all 6 is a really big change to the treatment quality for those plants. Standardised monitoring, reporting, and compliance conditions. So we've already talked about that. That is a big step change for the system. And in itself, if nothing else was done, would result in a significant uplift to the performance of plants. Covers the most common contaminants. So we aren't proposing that it would deal with things like heavy metals. There's only a very small number of plants that have limits for heavy metals, and that would continue to be able to be set through our consents. Really comprehensive guidance to support implementation. So one of the things that we can't do through the standards work program is require that a plant that's discharged into water has some kind of whakanoa process that enables the waste stream to contact land. That is outside of our powers. So when John talked about the case studies, so part of that was to get a really good understanding of the plants that we have out there that have some kind of whakanoa process as part of their infrastructure. So we can, as part of our guidance, let everyone know about how those plants are working and what has worked for communities, so that councils and their communities can pick that up. And we hope to see that a lot more where plants continue to discharge to water. Next slide, thanks. The small wastewater treatment plants. So this is intended to apply to plants of 1,000 or less. The technicians have told us that the way that you qualify for this plant is that you need an influent biological oxygen demand load of 85 kilos a day. That's an annual mean or less. That's because it's really hard to reliably calculate what a population equivalent is. So populations just vary up and down. And we see this with our drinking water regulation all the time. Populations vary up and down according to stuff like tourism. A classic example we see on the drinking water side is tangi. So you'll have, a marae that will only have 30 or 40 people living around it, and then you might have 10,000 people turning up in a day. So it's an annual mean, and it's calculated through the influent BOD line. So it's really clear to the territorial authority and the regional council whether the tailored small treatment plant standard will apply. So one of the proposals here, the main proposal, is that there won't be any treatment requirements for nutrients. So that there's total nitrogen and total phosphorus. That is because these small plants have a very low impact on their catchments in relation to nutrients, particularly when you compare it to the very high impact that farming has for those catchments. So it would be really expensive to require nutrient removal for these really small plants, and they tend to have a really low impact. Some of these plants that we've looked at during summertime, they have no impact on the environment at all. They sit there and evaporate. And then in wintertime, when it rains, they will discharge the local environment, but technicians have said they cannot actually discern what the impact is. They can't detect an impact compared to the broader catchment. So that's why the treatment requirements for nutrients is proposed to be removed. There would continue to be a requirement to treat for ammonia. So in terms of the nutrient treatment, continue to have a requirement to treat for ammonia. That's because ammonia is toxic to aquatic life. And so that would be a requirement for all of these plants. We are considering looking for submissions on less stringent treatment requirements for other parameters. So total suspended solids, oxidation ponds. This is not something that I'm an expert in. Apparently oxidation ponds have really cloudy waste streams, and that's because they use algae to treat stuff. So the algae is just cloudy. So what comes out of there is cloudy. And if you have a high total suspended solids treatment requirement, that would be really expensive to implement. Also considering a lower treatment requirement for pathogens, E. coli and enterococci. That is out for submissions, whether that would be appropriate. Finally, we are proposing operational requirements for these plants. So a legacy impact of our poorly maintained oxidation ponds throughout the country is they are not desludged. What that means is the sludge that sits on the bottom of them sits there for 20 years and it becomes so contaminated that it contaminates the site forever and leaches. And councils are not removing it because it's expensive to do, so they just leave it there. So the proposal is regular desludging of those plants every 5 years. That's intended to work with the biosolids standard, where the proposal is actually that rather than storing that sludge on site, so it just sits there as a contamination hazard, or taking it to the tip, where it eventually leaches back into waterways surrounding the tip, it is processed and can then be applied to land in a safe way. So this standard would only apply to the existing treatment plants. If there's a new one, or if a plant is upgraded, then the general standard would apply. And what we expect over time is that this small standard would apply to less and less plants. It would end up only applying to a very small number of plants and could be reviewed in future to see whether its application is still appropriate. Discharge the land standard. So this particular standard we worked on pretty hard, and we'll pause after this one. This is really important for the reasons John has said, because we live in New Zealand. Discharge the land is really important to communities in New Zealand. Also, it's really cheap. It's a really cheap, effective way of treating wastewater, because you have to treat it to a much lower level. The treatment's done by the land and the plants. The expensive thing is the land, right? And so what we see for small wastewater treatment plants, where you don't have to buy heaps of land, half of our small treatment plants discharge to land. So that's 25% of all the plants in the country are discharging to land all the time, or most of the time. So it's really important to have a standard for this. So the standard is intended to be really easy for councils to use in order to unlock this as an option. So what the council does is it looks for sites around a treatment plant that might be suitable for a discharge scheme, and then it does a site-specific risk assessment. Site-specific risk assessment will tell you whether the discharge is appropriate, whether the land's suitable. Then it tells you the risks. Based on the risks, you would get a treatment category. That treatment category is what the what the treatment requirements are for the scheme, and then you can design your scheme. So way before you get into the consenting process, a council can identify whether the discharge to land is appropriate. It will know the cost. It will be able to talk to communities about that. This is for quite a cheap price. The risk assessment is intended to be a reasonably cheap assessment. They would know the price, the cost of the discharge scheme, and they could talk to their communities about it, and it wouldn't change all the way through the consenting process. So once you locked it in early on, and it was the preferred option for your council, it wouldn't change. Again, really consistent monitoring and reporting requirements around this, and 35-year consents. So we've already had, I mean, this is classic, but we've had golf clubs coming to us saying, in Mangawhai, we currently discharge to water. We want to get the discharge at least partly out of the water. So we want to discharge to the golf club. How does this standard work? Because at the moment, we're not having much luck with the council. So that is quite encouraging. Yes, it's a golf club, but it's also discharged to land, so you've got to take swings and roundabouts. Will be very green grass, I suppose. Next slide, thanks. So this slide and the next one just set out how the site-specific risk assessment is going to work. So you do your site-specific risk assessment. It gives you a site capability category and a risk category. And then next slide, that will tell you what your loading rates and parameters are. So the really important thing here is you have to treat for nitrogen, phosphorus, and E. coli. You don't have to treat for all that other stuff, BOD, total suspended solids, all of that. So treatment requirements are intended to be low for discharge to land. The other part of this proposal is that every discharge scheme would have an operations and management manual that they'd be required to comply with, and that would tell them how to operate the scheme to keep it safe. So there's there's still be lots of requirements around monitoring your aquifer, making sure you didn't operate the scheme when it was flooding, making sure that you didn't operate it in the wrong weather conditions. Finally, as part of this standard, there are proposals around places that would be inappropriate to have a scheme. So close to people, Waitapu, there are quite a few areas where it would be inappropriate to have a scheme. So some exceptions proposed, and take a look at those and give us some submissions on that. And finally, so this slide's the same as the discharge to water. And I think we're up to Troy again.
Kia ora whānau. Hey, I've got a couple of pātai on here, and I'm going to kick off with Justine's. John, can you talk about the proposed bill and the one-size-fits-all for standards? For instance, can't go more stringent if that goes through.
I think I'm going to get Michael to talk to that.
Kia ora. So that is a proposal that has been made by this government. So in our legislation that is currently sitting in the Water Services Act, the standards would be minimum standards. So regional councils would be able to set treatment requirements higher than a standard, but couldn't go lower. For this cabinet and this government, the proposal is that regional councils wouldn't have any discretion. So the treatment requirements and the standards would be fixed. Regional councils couldn't go lower and they couldn't go higher. So that has placed quite that has been quite challenging for our work program to make sure that we develop standards that are really appropriate, because none of us are here to poison water or land. That's why we have a large number of receiving environments. There are many more receiving environments than you see internationally. That's why we have been engaged in a really rigorous process to establish what those treatment limits are, to make sure that they are the appropriate treatment limits. So the single standard approach, so what it does is it will really place a big emphasis on the standardization, on the cost effectiveness, on ensuring that consents, that backlog of consents is dealt with as quickly as possible. Standardization of infrastructure from this government's perspective, if you can't afford the treatment as a community, you're not going to upgrade. So they want standardization of infrastructure so it makes it more affordable for communities to upgrade. That's it in a nutshell, I would say.
I'd probably just add to what Michael has said. One of the key areas that we heard from our case study participants and an engagement to date is around, I guess, the importance of at-place decision making to iwi and hapu, and also that, I guess, to the point around the one-size-fits-all, that the treatment parameters or limits need to be as high as possible. And I guess on the first point around at-place decision-making, it's important to note that iwi and hapu and the role that you play at place is not changing under the proposals. So there will still be an element of at-place decision-making. You will still need to engage with your councils, your TAs and your regional councils on what type of discharge you may wish to seek a resource consent for. And there are a number of obligations that remain under the Local Government Act, which are not impacted by our standards and proposals. And regarding, I guess, that highest level of treatment, to Michael's point, there are a number of different factors that have come into play in considering the proposals, but it would be really useful for us to hear from communities around whether those limits and how they are currently proposed, how that interacts in your areas, so that we can have a look at that, because you're best placed, I suppose, to give us that local perspective as well, which will help in the next phase of the development. So it's important from an iwi and hapu perspective that the development of the standards, I guess, accounts for some of the perspectives that we heard through the case studies and our engagement to date.
Kia ora, John. Hey, we're almost there, whānau. Hopefully in that question and answer session, you've been able to get to the wharepaku or go and fill up your cup of tea. And now we'll kick off with the last section 8.
I think there was another question.
What's there? Aroha mai whānau.
Post.
Yes.
Is it, where did Michael get his shirt from? It's very stylish. I got it from H&M, thanks. Oh,
Aroha mai whānau. Hey, technologically challenged here. There's a couple of pātai that have come in. If the treatment requirements are fixed, this government's idea in Bill 3, can wastewater discharges be improved over 80 years to meet te ture whaimana o te awa o Waikato?
Yeah, so a couple of things here. So the first thing is the treat. So it's kind of a different system with treatment limits that are fixed in consents. So the treatment limits will be fixed in the consents, but it is always open. And in fact, we would expect the treatment plant to outperform the standards, right? So if everybody's complying with their consents, which is what our goal is, plants will need to overperform their consents.
There's just part 2 to this, brother, before you carry on. Can Waikato and Waipa be exceptions under these standards?
We've got this. Yep, got that. Te ture whaimana. Yep, I'll get to that. So we would expect plants to be outperforming the consents. In fact, the advice that we've received from the technical advisors is that most modern plants would overperform against the standards. So I suppose that's the first thing, is you can be engaging with your communities about the performance of plants, and you can expect those treatment requirements in the consent to always be met, and doing better is always an option. That being said, the treatment limits are set at a level that will protect the environment and public health. Need to always emphasise that. For the Waikato and Waipa catchments, and John can jump in on this. So we are working with those iwi to understand their preferences, and we will engage with others, relevant decision makers like the Waikato River Authority, the Regional Council, about Te Ture Whaimana and how the standards would apply in their catchment. Alongside that, the Waikato Tainui, Waikato River Authority and others have also made submissions to Parliament about how standards would apply at that kind of legislative level. So that work is ongoing. Yes, one of those preferences could be that standards don't apply in those catchments, but that is, we haven't got to that point with the engagement yet. We're continuing to engage on it. When we get those views, we'll be providing advice to the Minister of Local Government, because at the end of the process, the standards are a decision that is made by the Minister of Local Government and Cabinet. Got it?
Kia ora. The owner has another pātai. What is the dispute resolution process for ngā iwi regarding these standards?
Well, they're fixed. So if once they are fixed as part of the standards, you won't be able to go to the Environment Court and say we want higher treatment requirements.
Okay. Do we have any last minute pātai whānau before we carry on? Hei te pai.
So biosolids. So the biosolids standard is intended to work really as a complement to the discharge to water and discharge to land standards. So what we see in the country at the moment is, classic example is, I went with my son the other day to a forest, rangatawa, and so because he wanted to see if there was any rabbits there, and we went past the wastewater treatment plant. So it is sitting on an expired consent at the moment, I think like something like 10 years. It's not desludged. And it discharges next to a really beautiful forest, and it discharges into a lovely river, but it's not maintained very well. So what we see all over the country is plants that are not desludged. Sludge is like a national contamination problem that is not talked about. So that sludge just loads up with all kinds of toxic contaminants, and councils don't know what to do with it. This is something that we see all over the country, hundreds of plants. So the biosolid standard, the proposal here, this is based on long-standing guidelines that Water New Zealand have proposed, and it's something that's really common internationally. So you would take the sludge that comes out of a treatment plant, you'd get it early, not after 20 years, but you'd be getting it regularly. You process it to grade, and then it can be safely applied to land. And so that's how it's intended to work. So the standard proposes some restrictions around that. You couldn't apply the biosolids to wahitapu. You couldn't apply biosolids to areas where food was being grown. So there would be restrictions around the food side of things and contact. Have a look in the discussion document around those proposals. If we go to the next slide, please. So we're missing. So people who have been on the previous the other webinar presentations will have seen an extra slide. So the way that the standard works, right, is so that you have a pathogen grading requirement and a contaminant grading requirement. If you meet both of those requirements, applying biosolids to land with those exceptions would be a permitted activity. So you could do it pretty much anywhere in the country. That scheme's been operating like that in New Plymouth for 25 years now. So instead of them accumulating sludge and contaminating sites, the permanently contaminated sites, that the biosolids are being sold. It's an income stream for the council, and it's being safely applied to land. If you don't meet those processing requirements, it would either be a controlled activity, so you'd get a consent but controls around it, or restricted discretionary activity, so it would be subject to much higher consented controls. Overflows and bypasses, really important proposal here. So what we see all over the country is half of the regional councils are prohibiting overflows. Half of the regional councils are allowing them, but they have to be consented in some way. So really, really different approaches there. The other thing that we see is all networks overflow, and most they're designed to overflow. They're all designed to overflow because because the overflow is like a pressure release, and if they don't overflow somewhere, then manhole cover pops in the streets, and there's poo in the streets, and that absolutely cannot be allowed to happen. So all the networks are designed to overflow. Most of our networks are old, and so they overflow all the time. That's the significant majority of the networks in the country. So by prohibiting those overflows, the idea, and it's meant with good intention, the idea is that by prohibiting overflows, you try and reduce their frequency, but that's not what happens. What it does is it drives monitoring and reporting underground. Councils don't report those overflows anymore because they are prohibited. And so it's literally putting your head in the sand about something that is happening all the time. In Auckland, they went for an approach that we are proposing here, where all existing overflow points would have to be consented, and then there would be comprehensive monitoring and reporting requirements around those overflows. So communities, based on risks, the communities would know when they were happening, they would know why they were happening, they would be told immediately if they were a high risk overflow, and the council would need to be, well, they would be accountable for the overflow. They would, what has happened in Auckland is that the management of overflows is significantly reducing over time as the council understands its network and it directs its investment to the right place. Bypasses of treatment plants. So treatment plants have bypass arrangements, so if it rains too much, then they will discharge directly into the environment. Those are usually not consented. They're dealt with as emergency activities. Unfortunately, they happen all the time, but they are not. A consent isn't required for them. Many treatment plants don't have consents for them. So we are also proposing that there would be consents for bypasses, so everybody would know when they're happening, why they're happening, and they would be expected to reduce in frequency over time. So this is intended to really drive full transparency for overflows to communities to reduce their frequency over time. This is how the overflows will be monitored and reported. So telemetric monitoring will be required for all the overflow points that are classified as high risk. So they would report immediately, and then they would be expected to be reporting to the regional council, public health, and the community, to the community that is affected by the overflow. All new overflow points will be required to have telemetric monitoring. All pump stations and all the uncontrolled overflow points. So when a manhole pops off regularly, it would be required to have telemetric monitoring. So that's Bluetooth technology, so you know when it happens immediately. It's not very expensive, and so the reporting separated into that first response, so directly to the community, the regional council and public health, then follow up after a couple of weeks, what happened, why, and how can we mitigate that. So the standards, how will they be used really quickly? So the council, step one, council territorial authority develops its preferred option. So it does that with the community, local government legislation. So it needs to be engaging with community about whether the plant should be continue to discharge to water, whether you might move that discharge to land. If the plant is built on wahi tapu or a place that is not appropriate, then the council would need to continue to engage with the community on moving it. None of that would change. What would change is that the engagement would be based on the treatment requirements that are in the standards. So a council would say, if we're going to continue to discharge to Akaroa to the harbour, this is what the treatment requirements are. If we're going to discharge to land, this is what the treatment requirements are, and they could be really clear with communities about the cost of those options. Once they develop their preferred option with the community, they would go through the consent process in a normal way, but the treatment limits set in the standard would not change right through the process. So that's stages 2, 3, 4, and 5. The information that we have, the advice is that would really streamline the consenting process, because most of the conversation is around treatment quality. And then finally, compliance and monitoring right through to 6. So compliance and monitoring will look completely different than at the moment. There would be transparent monitoring around compliance with consents monthly on an annual basis. The regional councils, which currently don't take enforcement action regularly, would be benchmarked. They would all the consent conditions would be the same, so that compliance and enforcement would become standardised. And Taumata Arawai plays a national level oversight role of publishing things like whether enforcement action is being taken. Next slide, thanks. Exceptions to the standards. So we've talked about exceptions that would apply for the discharge to water standard. So where an exception applies to a standard, it's as if the standard doesn't apply and you go back to the standard RMA process. So they're only intended to apply in limited situations. And so some of the exceptions are set out in the discussion document. From memory, they are pristine environments, low discharge environments, if there are drinking water extraction points around the discharge. Transition arrangements. So really quickly, so at the moment we've got a whole lot of plants operating on section 124. So once the standards are made, the proposal is that a council could withdraw that application and make a new one based on what's in the standards, and so they would be able to do that and continue to operate on section 124. There is also a proposal that consents that expire within 2 years of the Water Service, Local Government Water Services Bill being enacted. They would have their expiry date extended so that they could look at the standards and make an application based on what's in the standards. Really important one for you guys is the bottom one there. At the moment, plants can operate on expired consents indefinitely. And the proposal in the discussion document is that would change. Plants could only operate on an expired consent for a maximum of 2 years. And the proposal is that would take effect 5 years after the standards are made, to allow us to get through that bow wave of consents.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Yeah, quite a lot of detail there.
I promised you it would be riveting whānau, and it has been. Hey, look, here's an outline of when our upcoming webinars are. So take a decent gander at that. Once again, consultation is open it's open until the 24th of April, 5 p.m. As I said before the chase starts, you need to have your submission in on 24th of April. If you have any further questions, please feel free to email us at kōrero@taumatarawai.govt.nz. Okay, you can view the proposed standards, case studies, additional information, and provide feedback by visiting our consultation page. By all means, please get a snapshot of that page, please, whānau, and a series of webinars are being run throughout the consultation period. You can find the dates and registration links for these webinars on the consultation page. Do we have any final pātai whānau? Well, not final pātai, any pātai. That's what happens when you get two guns presenting. They answer just about everything that's going on.
You get complete information overload. We're getting lots of questions coming through to our Kōrero inbox, email inbox. So please put questions through. It's really important for us that you get the right information about what the proposals are so that you can make submissions.
Hey, as a one-off, if you have a pātai, raise your hand.
Justine.
Kei a koe, Justine.
Kia ora. Sorry, I got somehow kicked myself out of the meeting halfway through. Did you answer my questions? And if we're going over time, could you email those answers, please?
Yes, we did answer your questions
Okay.
there. Michael went into quite a great detail for that too.
Oh,
I get kicked
fantastic!
out of
I'll watch the video. Thank you.
Ka pai.
Oh, great. Yeah, I get kicked out of meetings all the time as well, Justine. It's not just a you thing.
Hey, look, whānau, I can't see any more pātai coming through, and if that's us, I'm going to close for us. Okay. Before I close, just want to thank you, mihi to everybody for joining us. A lot of you joined during your lunch hour, which is amazing. So thank you very, very much. And last but not least, I want to mihi to our team, to John and to Michael, for providing such thorough kōrero to you, that the number of questions that we got through was very minimal compared to other webinars. Nō reire rungi I tēnā, ki te unihia te rito o te harakeke, kei hea te komako e kō, ki mai heha te mea nui o tēnei ao māku e ki atu. Whakatangi hia ki uta, whakatangi hia ki tai, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. Nō reire rungi I tēnā. Tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa.